Holly Humphrey served for 15 years as professor in medicine and dean for medical education at the University of Chicago. She is chair of the Kaiser Permanente Bernard Tyson School of Medicine's Board of Directors, chair emeritus of both the American Board of Internal Medicine and the American Board of Internal Medicine Foundation, and past president of the Association of Program Directors in Internal. During her tenure as Dean for Medical Education, her signature programs focused on equity, diversity, and inclusion, mentoring, and professionalism. In 1989, Dr. Humphrey and a colleague delivered the very first white coat ceremony address in this country. She co-founded the Bowman Society, an organization devoted to exploring issues of health disparity and providing mentoring focus for those who are underrepresented in medicine. She founded the university's Identity and Inclusion Committee, which advances civil discourse in medical school. And graduating medical students at the University of Chicago have honored Dr. Humphrey 5 times with the Gender Equity Award and 25 times as Favorite Faculty Teaching Award. Dr. Humphrey is currently the president of the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation. The Macy Foundation is the only national foundation dedicated solely to improving the education of health professionals. Their guiding principle is that health professional education has, at its core, a strong social mission to serve the public's need and to improve the health of the public. In her book, Mentoring in Academic Medicine, Dr. Humphrey writes that she learned at the foot of a master in US medicine, someone who provided enthusiastic reverse mentoring and inspiration for a lifetime. We are thrilled and honored for her to provide her insights and mentoring to another healthcare profession. Welcome, Dr. Humphrey.
Greg, thank you so much. I have to say that was, in so many ways, the most generous and most personal introduction that I've received. And I deeply appreciate the obvious preparation that you put into pulling that introduction together. So let me just check to be sure that all of you are able to hear me and that you're all able to see my slides projected. Good. Okay. Well, let's get started. I am so thrilled to be with all of you, and I'm thrilled actually for a number of reasons, but I must say that among the reasons that I am particularly excited to be with you is that we have a chance to address 3 key questions. Those questions are we creating a workforce to meet society's needs? Are we meeting our moral obligations as health professionals? And are we focused on learning in the clinical learning environment? And while these questions intrigue me on a daily basis and something that I devote a good deal of my time to focusing on, it was in fact your mission and vision that really created energy and excitement for me as I thought about joining you today. Because this mission and this vision are as bold as I have seen in any health professions organizations. And so to know that you're going to spend this weekend trying to do the work of this mission and vision is truly very energizing for me, and I hope that it will be for all of you. So let's turn to that first question. Are we creating a workforce to meet society's needs? And I think it's the case that COVID-19 pandemic has shown us on the front page something that we've known about for a long, long time. And that is that we have some very significant disparities in health and healthcare in America. And what you see projected here are age-adjusted mortality statistics for various populations in the country. So the indigenous patients have a 3.3 greater likelihood of dying with COVID-19 compared with white and Asian populations in the United States. And you see before you the relative rates of mortality for Pacific Islanders, Latinos, and Blacks. So as I said, these disparities are something we've known about for a long time. And among the things that certainly contribute to those disparities are the makeup of our workforce itself. And what you see projected on the screen in front of you is the makeup of the physical therapy workforce by race and ethnicity compared with the United States population as a whole. So my guess is that as a profession, a physical therapist, you would, like we in medicine would, like to have a diversity in our workforce that more clearly aligns with the diversity of the population of this country. We in medicine have a long way to go. And what you see projected here are the percentage of total enrollees in United States medical schools, broken down first by gender, women on the left side of your screen, men on the right side of your screen, race and ethnicity plotted with the blue circles showing Black women, Black men, the gold diamonds, Hispanic women, Hispanic men, American Indian, Alaskan Natives, Native American, Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders way down here at the bottom in a straight flat line. What you don't see depicted on these particular graphics that are showing us the time period from 1980 to 2020 is that these graphs would look nearly identical if we were to go all the way back to the 1950s. So we have not, as a medical profession, been able to do what our aspiration is, and that is to more clearly have a workforce that aligns with the diversity of the United States population. We know that's important in part because of the social determinants of health and the very powerful role that the social determinants of health play in the health of the American people. These social determinants ranging from access to education, healthcare access, economic stability, and so forth. And I think a very important statement made by the World Health Organization that it's the unequal distribution of health damaging experiences, not in any sense a natural phenomenon, but the result of poor social policies, unfair economic arrangements, and bad politics. And I think all of us know that not a lot has changed. And just earlier today, I saw that the life expectancy in the United States has now gone down again, continuing a trend that has been present now for the last several years. What may be new to you is that in the same way that our patients' health is deeply impacted by the social determinants of health, my colleague, David Muller, and colleagues at the Icahn School of Medicine in New York City have written a paper about the social determinants of medical education. And basically, they're the same thematic elements that make it very difficult and sometimes so challenging that someone cannot go forward with a medical education because of the power of these social determinants. And in fact, Muller and his colleagues in this paper, which was published just last month in Academic Medicine, said this: social determinants are the most important consideration in determining successful entry, progression, and completion of medical education. On this slide, you see depicted the campus of the University of Chicago, which is where I cared for patients for almost 40 years as a medical student, a resident, and then as a member of the faculty. What you see on the left side of this slide is a heat map of life expectancy, where the more intense colors are the shorter life expectancies. The deepest orange is a life expectancy of 60 years, compared with the lighter colors on the heat map the lightest being a life expectancy of 90 years. Many of the patients who I cared for at the University of Chicago, located on the south side of Chicago, had a life expectancy of 60 years. The Gold Coast, just 20 miles north, has a life expectancy of 90 years. That disparity, that difference in life expectancy is the greatest disparity in the shortest radius of any area in the United States. I'm obviously not proud of that fact. In fact, it fills me with great sorrow, but it also fills me with incredible passion and energy to try to address this incredible problem. One of the ways that we have thought about and in fact acted on the need to try to change the workforce in the United States for physicians is by following a holistic approach to admissions. And this is an approach that was described by the Association of American Medical Colleges, where an experiences, attributes, and metrics model is a model that could be used for medical school admissions. And this graphic is displaying that approach. What I'd like to share with you today over the course of my remarks are 3 specific case examples. The first one is very personal to me, and the other 2 will be more theoretical and a little bit more distance from my personal experience. And to share these 3 cases, I am going to use a framework that was developed many years ago by Laurent Delos, an educational psychologist, who wrote about how adults learn. And that framework shows us that when the challenge in learning ranges from low to high is plotted against the support that the adult learner receives, plotted from low to high, we can have various expected outcomes. When the challenge is low and the support is low, little learning takes place. In fact, he termed that quadrant stasis. When the challenge is really high and the support is low, the adult learner often retreats from the opportunities for learning. When the challenge is really high and the support is also very high, growth occurs. And this is the quadrant in which we hope our adult learners will end up spending a good portion of their time. However, very frequently, the quadrant where our learners spend more of their time is when a challenge is perceived and experienced as low and the support is high, their learning may be constricted by confirmation, or in this quadrant where the challenge is very high and the support is low, by retreating. So let's keep that framework in mind as we try to solve some of the significant problems in American healthcare as it pertains to the workforce. So one particular question could be, should we consider using holistic review to create diversity among our learners? And by using this framework, and to answer that question, a faculty member might say, well, we can only admit people if they apply to the program. The number of qualified applicants just aren't in the applicant pool. I wonder if any of you have heard that kind of thing. It's also possible that one of our faculty members could say, holistic review introduces too many factors and is too hard to interpret. We should stick to normative measures like grades and test scores. Alternatively, a faculty member's point of view could be, by connecting our holistic review to our mission statement, we aligned our evaluation of candidates with the most important factors and increased the diversity of our student body in multiple ways. Or most ideally, holistic review and admissions must be connected with a holistic retention strategy, which encompasses not only admissions, but curricular and student affairs so that learners have equal opportunities to be successful. So this is a theoretical approach to admissions and to the educational programming for creating a more diverse workforce. Let me turn to that very personal example that I promised to share. So, the medical school that I became a dean for medical education for in 2003 was a school that was facing an LCME accreditation review, and a school that was facing the challenges of dealing with the kind of patient population and the health disparities that I already referred to. So what did our medical school do related to holistic admissions and retention? Well, first of all, what we did is we wrote a mission statement, and we did it together with faculty, with deans, and with students. And here's the mission statement that we came up with. At the University of Chicago, in an atmosphere of interdisciplinary scholarship and discovery, the Pritzker School of Medicine is dedicated to inspiring diverse students of exceptional promise to become leaders and innovators in science and medicine for the betterment of humanity. And it was the key phrases within this mission statement that allowed us to take the next step in developing our holistic review screening rubric by using the exact phrasing from that mission statement and using the holistic review model that I shared with you from the Association of American Medical Colleges. So what specifically did we do? Well, first of all, we looked at the diversity of the admissions committee and redoubled our efforts to make sure that the admissions committee was in fact diverse. Each year, we had our committee participate in implicit bias training. We devoted a significant portion of our overall budget to scholarship support. We worked very diligently with the diversity of our medical school faculty and staff to engage them in the process and to have them help us begin to change the tide. We created student affinity groups so that all of the students in our school felt as if they belonged and had a place to belong. Now, I can't say this was perfect, but this is certainly what we did and with the goal in mind of what we were trying to accomplish. And then we took student feedback very seriously and engaged our students in the co-creation of the admissions process and of our medical school operations. And then we used data, largely from the students and from the faculty, to assess the student experience and the learning climate. And this is what happened in the period from 2004 to 2021. You see the percent of students who enrolled in our medical school from groups historically underrepresented in medicine. And the overall upward slope is something that came about as a result of a multi-year effort. And we didn't back away from that, even in the years when the trend was downward. We stuck with it over the long term for all the reasons that I've already mentioned. Now, it's also the case that this has development beyond a single school. And in the most recent year, the medical students who enrolled in United States medical schools in 2021 saw a 21% increase in Black or African American matriculants, an 8% increase in Asian matriculants, a 7% increase in Hispanic and Latino matriculants. And if you remember back to those flat line graphs that I showed you that haven't really changed much since 1950, these represent very substantial and the most significant increases that I have personally seen in my lifetime. Now, many are claiming that it was the holistic admissions approach that led to these dramatic increases, and that holistic admissions approach in part was precipitated by the pandemic, when we were no longer able to administer the secure MCAT examination, where interviews could not take place in person. They had to be done virtually, and a whole host of environmental factors really precipitated schools adopting a holistic admission strategy, whether they had been doing that previously or not. But now the great challenge for the medical profession is to develop the holistic retention strategies so that this diverse group of learners not only feel as if they belong, but can advance successfully in the schools of medicine across the country. So I share this example with you in case it may have some important themes of applicability to the workforce and the future workforce for physical therapists. So let's turn to this second question. Are we meeting our moral obligation as health professionals? And I am quite certain that this is a topic you will likely turn to again and again over this weekend. Are we truly focused on and thinking about the obligation that each of our health professions, and in your case, the physical therapists for America, are we meeting that moral obligation? Are health professions a public trust is an important question that I think is a starting point. And Ken Ludmer, in his book, Time to Heal, American Medical Education from the Turn of the Century, makes a very substantial claim that all health professions are, in fact, a public trust. And they're a public trust in order to provide exemplary health and health care for the American people, and that the graduates of our programs are prepared at the time of graduation to practice as a health professional without supervision. Now, I was inspired by your oath. I don't know to what extent you actually use this oath in your schools, but it certainly speaks to the moral obligation that physical therapists have to their patients and to America. I'd like to turn to Are you able to hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'm getting some messages on my screen that suggest I'm muted. So I'd like to provide some background context about the patients who we care for who are differently abled. And again, this context comes from physicians, and it's somewhat surprising information because when you think about the Americans with Disabilities Act having been passed now more than 30 years ago, what kind of progress have we made in America? And my understanding was influenced by this paper that Dr. Lisa Iazzoni published with her colleagues in Health Affairs in February of 2021. This was a large survey of physicians, and that survey data had 82% of physicians reporting that their impression, their perception that people with a significant disability have an overall worse quality of life. 56% of physicians strongly agreed that they would welcome people with disability into their practices. And I just invite all of us to think about what about the rest of the physicians and how are they managing people with disability in their practice? 41% of physicians felt confident in their ability to provide equal quality care to people with disability. And 18% of physicians strongly agreed that the healthcare system treats disabled patients unfairly. It's also the case that while that study demonstrated those perceptions, we know that by taking patients with disability and zeroing in on specific groups by ethnicity and race, we see varying levels of disability broken down by those groups, such that among American Indians and Alaskan Natives, 3 in 10 have a disability. For our Black patients, 1 in 4 have a disability. For whites, 1 in 5, and you see the rest of the statistics in front of you. You can then look at those same patient groups and the percent of adults with a disability who are obese or smoke. And I think this gives us a sense of who the patients are broadly and how they are impacted in terms of treatment in a differently abled condition. What you see on this particular slide is the weighted population estimate of adults with disabilities broken down by age group. And as our population ages, the percent of the population with disability obviously increases. So are we prepared, and are we preparing our health professionals to deal with an aging population who are increasingly representing a greater proportion of patients with disabilities? So for the second case study, how can health professions education improve healthcare and health professions education for patients with disabilities, knowing that the patients with disabilities represent a large and very often underserved patient population? So the Delos framework, once again, these are the kinds of responses that I have certainly heard over the course of my own career. How can health professions education improve healthcare and health professions education for patients with disabilities? Well, learners will encounter disability in the course of their education. No special curriculum is needed because not much can be done to improve the health and quality of life. We can't teach about disability because we don't have enough faculty who feel comfortable providing effective care for disabled people. So many of those patients are obese and smoke anyway. We are incorporating some additional didactic sessions to raise awareness. We will strongly encourage students to attend. The goal is to move students past a narrow medical conception of disability to consider a model that values human variation. And then in the more ideal state for growth, in addition to incorporation of didactic learning in the required curriculum, we are incorporating hands-on experiences in clinical skills training by work with standardized patients and rotations in clinical sites which serve individuals with a variety of disabilities. So knowing that background and that context, I think gives us an opportunity to really think about whether or not we can simultaneously not only improve our curricula for patients who are differently abled, but what about learners themselves? And I have to say, from the standpoint of training a future physician workforce, in medicine, we have not done a good job. In fact, we are, once again, decades behind in terms of incorporating learners who have various kinds of disabilities into our medical schools. In fact, it is probably not going too far to say that we have actively excluded learners with disabilities from medical school. And if we use the Laurent Delos framework, these are now specific kinds of responses that I have heard from members of my own faculty. Well, we have technical standards in place to make sure that all students complete all components needed to graduate. Even if you plan on being a psychiatrist, you still have to complete and succeed in your surgery clerkship. Another faculty member who regularly said, people with disabilities have no place in the health professions because they can't perform. Besides, a lot of people claim to have disabilities just to get advantages in test taking. Another faculty member, when students let us know about disabilities, we work with the disability office to provide appropriate accommodations to allow that individual to be successful in the health professions. Just because you have a disability does not mean you cannot be an effective health care professional. And in many cases, I think that our more advanced schools are taking this point of view. And very often the way that translates is into making sure the doors are wide enough to accommodate a wheelchair, making sure we have ramps so that people can access buildings and that our restroom facilities can accommodate people. Or if someone needs additional time to take a standardized secure exam, that additional time is given for exam taking. However, the skills needed to become a physician or a physical therapist require so much more than being able to access the building or have extended time on an examination. So what can we do better as health professions in order to really accommodate learners who may have a disability? And here you see in this quadrant, learners who identify as having a disability carry a disability identity that can really inform their clinical practice and lead to more culturally competent care. In addition, the most dramatic learning can come when it is a peer who directly challenges negative biases. Therefore, we have included disability as a key component of diversity that we seek in our student body. I do not think the vast majority or even a slight majority of medical schools are in this quadrant today, but I do think that this is a quadrant that we could aim for and aspire toward. Let's turn to that third question. In our learning environments, are we really focused on learning? Is it learning that we're focused on in the clinical learning environment? This is the way that I am defining the learning environment. It's the social interactions, organizational culture, and physical and virtual spaces that surround and shape the experiences, perceptions, and learning of students. Not unlike the fish swimming in clear, clean water, experiencing an environment where they can succeed. This is a framework for the clinical learning environment that was developed several years ago for a Macy Foundation sponsored conference on the topic. And what you see here is the interaction of the personal characteristics of the individual in the learning environment with the social interactions that take place and are so important in that learning environment, with the organizational policies, procedures, and practices that have a very important and influence on the learning environment. And then the physical, and over the last few years, the importance of the virtual spaces in this learning environment. And it is meant to be a very interactive type of experience for the learners in this kind of an environment. So I was very intrigued when my colleague Dana Levinson at the Macy Foundation came upon this paper that perhaps some of you are aware of, and that is a paper that was published by a physical therapy group at the University of Iowa, comparing their learning environment to the learning environment in medical schools. And I'm going to share just a few of the snapshots from this paper by Shields and colleagues. Each year, students who graduate from medical schools in this country complete what is called a graduation questionnaire. And at the conclusion of medical school, not only is that questionnaire completed by the graduates, but several months following graduation, the Association of American Medical Colleges feeds that information back to each medical school and lets us see our aggregated information compared to national benchmarks of all the students graduating from allopathic medical schools in the United States in that given year. And then we see prior year's data so we can identify important trends in our medical education program and importantly in our learning environment. And so the group at Iowa who published this paper administered to their students some of the same questions that were part of the medical student graduation questionnaire. And they did this over a multi-year period from 2009 to 2017. And what you see plotted here are the responses of their physical therapy students in the white bar graph compared with the aggregate responses of all the medical students who were graduating from US medical schools in that same time period. And so one of those questions is, overall, I'm satisfied with the quality of my physical therapy education. And you can see this group at Iowa is really very happy, nearly 100%. Overall, we're satisfied with the quality of their physical therapy education compared with the national benchmark of slightly under 90%. A second question, if you could revisit your career choice, would you choose to attend physical therapy school again? And again, you see almost 100% of the physical therapy students would do it again, compared with the medical students, where many, by the time of graduation from medical school, would make a different decision, at least according to their graduation questionnaire. Students were asked to rate their experience in the learning environment. And on this scale of favorability, the higher favorability scores are the most positive review of their learning environment. And once again, the emotional climate at the University of Iowa in the eyes of their students was very positive, and especially positive when compared to the emotional climate for medical students. Then faculty-student interactions, and you see a similar change here. Another question, my school has done a good job of fostering and nurturing my development as a physical therapist, the percent who agree or strongly agree. Again, my development as a person and my development as a future physical therapist or as a future physician. So the question plotted on this slide is, there are disconnects between what I am taught about professional behaviors and attitudes and what I see being demonstrated by the faculty. And the physical therapist did not see much of a disconnect. Plotted here, the percent who sometimes, fairly often, or very often, or always saw that disconnect looks like it's in the 2% range compared to the graduates of medical schools where it was over 50%. And then a whole set of questions on this graduation questionnaire about the faculty members' professional behaviors. Again, you see the physical therapy students compared with the aggregate AAMC data. And the faculty were evaluated in a whole variety of different domains, resolving conflicts in ways that respect the dignity of all involved, advocating appropriately on behalf of their patients, taking time and effort to explain information to patients, active listening and showing interest in patients, being respectful of patients' dignity and autonomy, showing empathy and compassion, showing respectful interaction with students, providing direction and constructive feedback, being respectful of other health professions, respecting diversity, being respectful of staff and other physical therapists or other physicians, using professional language and avoiding derogatory language, and then respecting patient confidentiality. So I don't know if the University of Iowa physical therapy program is an outlier or if they represent the mainstream of physical therapy, but more importantly, the method of getting feedback and having benchmark data to compare our learning environments with, I think, is a very useful tool that can help us improve our learning environments over time. And so I, as I said, really enjoyed reading this study and learning about the ways in which this one particular program used a data instrument that I spent a good deal of my time and my career focused on. So what are we focused on in these clinical learning environments? Well, ultimately, we're really focused on learning so that the patient care that takes place in these learning environments can be the exemplary patient care that we're aspiring to. And I know that a year ago, you focused on the master adaptive learning. And ideally, it's exactly that kind of learning that we aspire to and hope is taking place in our learning environments. We also know, beyond master adaptive learning, that learning to manage uncertainty in clinical practice is one of the great challenges. And one of the areas of scientific study and inquiry that is certainly becoming an integral part of the curriculum for the teaching of medical students and residents. And I don't know to what extent that is part of the curricula for physical therapists. So that organizational culture that we all have varying degrees of responsibility for, we know is important. And in fact, is so important that it will eat up the strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And so paying attention to it and cultivating and nurturing that organizational culture is essential. It's essential now, perhaps more than ever, because all of our educational programming is taking place in the context of a society where our social fabric is fraying. And it's stunning in so many ways that during this COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen the most brilliant scientific advances in more than a generation. And at the same time, we've seen a widening in the trust gap. And this is data from the National Opinion Research Center, which is collected on a very regular basis to see trends in the social performance of citizens of this country. And on this particular graph, we see the percentage of Americans who say that they have a great deal of confidence in the scientific community. You see the trends from 2000 to 2020. And this gap is the largest gap in confidence in the scientific community that we've seen in 5 decades. And you also see that it's falling along partisan lines. So one of the take-home messages for today is that we should consider reorienting all of our health professions education around a sociocultural axis. Initially, when medical education developed, it was very student-centered. As medical schools were just being built and accredited for the very first time, it was all about the student and what they were learning. Then it became very faculty-centered as there was a rise in funding through the NIH and other streams for faculty to develop careers as educators. And then with the advent of insurance companies, Medicare and Medicaid, our health professions became very patient-centered. And I'm inviting us to think about orienting all of our health professions education in a socio-cultural context, because the structural determinants of health are foundational to our patients' health and healthcare. We need to be mindful of and aware of the ways in which public health policies inform our patients' health and healthcare, and likewise then need to have a place in the curriculum and experience of our learners. And we need to bring the same kind of rigor to managing uncertainty as we have brought to other areas of healthcare and healthcare delivery. And to do that, I would suggest that this sociocultural context be ever mindful of the environment in which our students are learning, our faculty are teaching and assessing, and importantly, our patients are receiving care. And with that, I'd like to stop and hear questions that might be on your minds.
Dr. Humphrey, thank you. Thank you so much for such a thought-provoking and insightful address, and one that I think was particularly targeted to our profession. So I appreciate all the work and effort you put into preparing for that. So I will ask you guys to raise your hands, as I see a few of you already have. And if you use the raised hand feature, then I will call on folks in order that way. And so Jill, I'll start with you.
Okay, thank you. Let me put my hand down because I always forget to do that. So one of my questions is, if you admit students in this holistic manner, it is very important to give them the support that they need through the program. It's never really discussed what that looks like. That's really what I want to key into. What is it that I need to do, and how would that be equitable at the same time?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. And I think that it is a multi-pronged approach. I don't think it's a one size fits all or even a quick fix, but it needs multiple layers in order to really create the supportive culture. And the supportive culture obviously begins with policies, procedures, and practices, but it extends very importantly to the people who are interacting with those students. And that includes staff, it includes faculty, it includes the patients and patient families. And there are stress points along the way, generally multiple stress points. And to some extent, those are predictable. You know that there are certain times in your curriculum that are much higher stress than other times in your curriculum. Some of those stress points are not predictable. Someone may have a death in a family or a breakup of a relationship or feeling financial strain or any number of things that are totally unpredictable. And so those things generally go way beyond the training that we might do for our staff and faculty, for the policies that we might have in place. And we need to have the kind of responsiveness at the time that those crises and stress points happen. Often, in my experience, the kinds of issues that come up are issues related to finances and or mental health and mental health care. One of the things that many of our residency programs and medical schools are beginning to put in place are mental health care resources that are automatically in place for every student when they enroll in the school. And the student and or resident is scheduled to see a mental health professional as an introductory session, as a screening session for particular vulnerabilities. And each individual student or resident has the opportunity to opt out. So it's not something they're required to do, but it's also sending a very powerful message when it's part of the fabric, when it's part of the institution, that everyone is scheduled for an appointment and that we have the staff who are prepared to see you and be a support for you throughout the way. So, you know, I do think that there are multiple different levels that you have to have in place, develop over time, nurture over time. And I recognize that these things are expensive. They require dedicated resources in order to build that kind of infrastructure. And they require the right people on the front lines with, you know, the ones who have the empathic heart and the courage, often the moral courage to confront whatever comes their way and walks through the door.
Thank you very much. And I'll be seeing you Tuesday at Touro University. You're speaking for our IPE Summit, isn't that?
Wonderful. I am. I'll be there on Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Dawn, you're up.
I know there's two Dawns on here, so I don't know if you need Dawn Brown. Gotcha.
Dawn
All right.
Brown.
Thank you very much. So I want to go in response to, I believe, what Jill just said when, how do you determine what support systems the students need? Well, I'll take it back down to the foundational level. Ask the students, even though we assume sometimes the students don't know what they don't know, but they're one of the key stakeholders. We exist as faculty for our students. And so how often do we as faculty truly get to know our students beyond their mere cognitive abilities, their learning abilities? And so sitting down and taking the time, especially when they enter as first years, but making it an ongoing process during each year that they're in your program to determine what is it that you need to be successful, to thrive. Tell me what are your perceived barriers, whether it be financial, whether it be mental, whether it be academic, so that we can support you better. Because sometimes we make assumptions as faculty members, and those assumptions might not be quite correct. Yes, we have resources on campus, whether it be in your program or in your department or in your universities as a whole. But oftentimes it takes going back down to the foundational level and have a conversation with your students.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's a really important point. Thank you.
Ike, Sheldon.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Mike Sheldon. I'm the Associate Provost for Academic Affairs at the University of New England. I enjoyed your presentation. And I wanted to ask a question about one of the case studies, the ones that you said was closest to home. And as you began the process, did you also engage in a multi-stakeholder a conversation to define what diversity, equity, and inclusion means for your community? I'm becoming increasingly aware that they're related but different constructs, and you can achieve one but maybe not have the other, and how you go about addressing all of those. And again, going back, did you ask the students what they were looking for as well? So I'm kind of curious how you went about that process. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful question. And let me just say that it's always so much easier to talk about these things in retrospect. Because we can't always see the future as we're creating and developing these things. So I'll say a few things about that. First is we were very intentional about inclusiveness as we developed that mission statement. I had a lot of feedback and a lot of input from multiple stakeholders as that mission statement was being developed and literally, wordsmithed. In the case of medical schools, and I don't know to what extent this is the case for physical therapy schools, part of our accreditation process requires that we define as a school what we mean by diversity. It was once the case that our accreditor would tell us what they meant by diversity, but then many years ago, they stopped doing that and they said each school should define what they mean by diversity, and they should be embracing the community in which they're serving. And so, to a large extent, that I think was a good thing. And so we have to do that on a very regular basis to meet accreditation standards. So that was already in our background, and it was largely driven by our patient population and who we were caring for. And that was the main way in which we developed our original definitions of diversity. Now, the issue related to inclusiveness and belonging came later. And here's exactly how it happened for me personally. Once we started having some success with the percent increases of students from groups historically underrepresented in medicine, I started getting more and more invitations to present the data to important groups within the university, such as the board of trustees or the alumni group or a whole host of groups that you can probably easily imagine. And the more that I found myself standing up in front of audiences, sharing this positive upward trajectory in our success in creating a more diverse class, the more I started asking myself, gosh, what's the experience like for these students? Are they feeling like they belong here? Are they feeling positive about their experience? And I knew what our graduation questionnaire said, but I didn't have the kind of specificity that I needed, and I didn't have a breakdown by race and ethnic group to give me any degree of comfort with the graphs I was showing people. And so that caused my colleagues and I to undertake a qualitative research study with our current and recently graduated alumni who came from groups historically underrepresented in medicine, and asked them in a qualitative research fashion, what their experience in our school had been like. And from that scholarly project, I learned the following. Number one, the students were overall very positive about their educational experience because they felt what we had advertised to them turned out to be reality in terms of our commitment to diversity. And the specific thing that they commented on was, your mission statement says that you're committed to diversity, and the very first class that we took when we became students was a class on healthcare disparities. and we were introduced to the community, and we saw the ways in which the social determinants worked against certain patients and certain populations of patients. So there was authenticity between our mission statement and the very first class that they took in our medical school. The second thing that they said is that our methods of assessment created belonging and a feeling that we were all in this together, and that the peer network was a network that supported one another, was not competitive or undermining of one another, but a network that supported one another. And our students from underrepresented groups said that was largely because of our assessment system, which was a pass-fail, non-ranked numerical system. And then the third thing that our students said, and our alumni in that study, was there were times when we bore the disproportionate burden or the minority tax of being part of a minority group to serve on the committees and be the spokespersons. And we were really looking to have a more diverse faculty who looked more like the medical school class looked. So that's a very specific answer, but it came about in the way that I just described. And from it, I learned a great deal about what their experience was actually like.
Thank you, Jim. Gordon.
Hi, yes, my name is Jim Gordon. I'm from the University of Southern California. That was really very stimulating and I think a great way to start off this summit. I was interested in you. So you ended up with this by sort of advocating, I suppose, for I think what you called a socio-cultural axis for the educational institutions, for the health professional educational institutions, and I wonder if you could expand a little bit on that, in two ways. One, what you mean by that, what that might look like, and second, how do we get there? I mean, some of us may still be trying to get from faculty-centered to patient-centered, and so you know, and I wonder if this is something that we can do individually, or you sort of implied that there are a lot of societal, reasons why we might move from one to the other. So anyway, if you could just expand a little bit on that, it would be helpful to me.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and one that I am personally thinking a lot about. But I don't have a magic recipe for how we're going to get there. What I do know and do have experience with is that the social determinants of health are responsible for 80% of health. And so largely the curriculum in medical school has been focused on that 20%, the 20% of a patient's health and healthcare that we understand scientifically, that we develop great therapeutics for, terrific interventions for. But what about the 80%? The 80% is rooted in the structural determinants and the society in which we live and in which our patients are trying to receive health and healthcare. And the thing that has really brought this to the fore for me, quite honestly, is the COVID-19 pandemic, where we have seen not only that growing divide along partisan lines about trust, perhaps fueled in large part by misinformation. We have patients who, according to the latest studies that I'm reading, patients and their families who are attacking their healthcare professionals, the nurses, the doctors, the other members of their healthcare team. And I mean, these are disturbing accounts of what our healthcare professionals are facing in their day-to-day work. So I think for us to be focused on that 20% of a patient's health and healthcare and not take into account the 80%, of health and healthcare for our patients, and then to do all of that outside of the context of the daily interactions when patients and their families are arriving in our emergency departments, our hospitals, our hospital beds, our clinics, and maybe disrespecting and attacking in a way that is just unprecedented in my experience. I think we need to do a much bigger, more important foundational structure to our educational programming, taking advantage of and learning from our social scientist colleagues. I mean, they've been studying trends in society. That's the definition of their body of work. And a focus on biology and science can be deeply enriched by learning from our social scientist colleagues about these societal trends and about how we can perhaps more appropriately make interventions so that the hospital is not just the repair shop, which it's been historically, but in fact, health for the population is really much more rooted in the communities where they live and the prevention that's available and the education that's available. So obviously that's a very big undertaking, but it represents some of which is under our direct control. And that is the curriculum and the daily experiences that our students have.
Thank you, Rain Osborne.
Wow, thanks. That was not only a really thought-provoking presentation, but a really thought-provoking response there too. So thanks for that. So I'm going to go a little bit different direction with this and thinking kind of down the line. And obviously, you know, to get diversity, you know, into the residency programs and further down, you have to get them into the door to begin with. But I'm just curious, like in medicine, as you go into the specialties and residencies, how does the diversity problem that exists coming into those programs, then does it kind of stay the same, or does it morph in some way as we go into specialties and different kinds of specialties?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll have a two-part answer. In general, it gets worse. And the reason it gets worse is that, you know, the medical schools are the largest cohort. And then when they graduate and go into residencies, those are just much smaller cohorts. So the feeling of isolation and loneliness and being the sole underrepresented minority member of a residency program becomes very real. And, you know, there are some specialties of medicine that are themselves very small specialties, plastic surgery, otolaryngology, those are small programs. And so to be, you can really just feel much, much more isolated and lonely, and the assessment systems can be pretty archaic. So it gets worse, and in some cases it gets significantly worse. And that's the second part of my question, is that the more that we as a profession have been collecting data and analyzing that data, the more that we can see that there are some specialties that seem to have been much more intentional about perhaps using a holistic approach to their recruitment of residents, and others that perhaps just have not been intentional because there are significant differences between specialties. Some specialties which have very limited diversity. In fact, it almost looks like the 20s, 30s, 40s. By race, ethnicity, by gender. There are some specialties that are very segregated by gender, even in 2022.
Thank you. I'm going to be mindful of Dr. Humphrey's time, and I know I can maybe we can squeeze in a couple more questions, and then we'll see how it goes after that. So, Amy.
Great, thank you. I'm glad I made the cut. Hi.
Hi.
I am Amy Heath from Western Michigan University. Thanks so much for all this discussion. It's been fantastic. My question is, we've talked a lot about the increase in medicine for underrepresented students, particularly related to the holistic admissions approach. I'm curious to know how the accreditation requirements have influenced whether or not programs are taking on the holistic approach or what that relationship looks like.
Yeah, that is a great question. And in fact, the MACP Foundation is currently funding, we have a grant with a scholar at Yale University who's really trying to help us answer that question. And I would say it's our impression that the accreditation standards have made a positive difference in terms of using holistic admissions and creating a more intentionally diverse medical student body. As I mentioned in my talk, I think the COVID-19 pandemic really precipitated that and accelerated it in a way that we haven't seen before. But I do think the accreditation standards have had a positive impact. Now, here's the problem, or the potential problem, is if you use that process to admit a much more diverse class, you must have a similar approach, not only to, in our case, for physician training, the medical school part of the programming, but for the whole pathway, for the residency part of the program, for the profession itself. And it's in those domains that we have a lot of work to do. And in terms of the profession of medicine, we have, for the most part, a major chasm between our undergraduate medical education and our graduate medical education residency programs. And in summary, the medical schools are owned by the universities by and large. The residency programs are owned by the hospitals by and large. And that chasm, in some cases, can be very wide. We have some examples of schools where there isn't such a great chasm, but we just have a lot of work to do. And I think there is a moral element to this, because for medicine, we're inviting a student from an underrepresented group who may come from a family of low socioeconomic means to consider taking on a debt burden of $200,000 or $300,000 and then get all the way down the system and somehow not be good enough based on an assessment system that might be in place in a particular residency program or a particular specialty. And so we're at this moment in time where there's a lot of positive energy on one end of the pipeline, but it hasn't reliably and consistently flowed through to the entire pipeline.
Very good. So do you have time for maybe one or two more questions?
Sure. Yes.
All right. So Rupal, you're up.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Well, thank you, Dr. Humphrey. It was a wonderful presentation and have loved the discussion so far. So I wanted to go back to a point you made about, obviously the social determinants of health and how important they are, and that only 20% of what we do is sick care or medical care, and we need to shift our focus in education. And so medical schools are also bound by criteria from accreditation to teach, as we are in physical therapy. So have you seen a shift in change in criteria for accreditation in medical school education to focus more on social determinants? Because all of us in our profession, do have to teach to criteria along with other things. And it's always a balance of, well, how much of what you teach focuses on meeting this criteria, and what is this other good stuff, fluff stuff, whatever people call it. So just wanted your thoughts on that.
Yeah, we do have some accreditation expectations for medical schools that require experiences in the community to try to address some of these issues. But I would say that by and large, those accreditation requirements don't have the same kind of teeth as some of the other accreditation requirements. But at the same time that I say that, in general, in my experience, the students who come into medical school have a huge appetite for learning about the structural determinants, about impacting the structural determinants. They are more energized and care about the world in which we live and climate, the burden of, the climate issues and community-based issues, that it's, I sometimes felt like I should just step out of the way and let them do their important work. And that is one of the important recommendations that the Macy Foundation is making related to medical school curricula and nursing profession curricula. And my guess is it may well apply to physical therapy schools as well. And that is the co-creation of a curriculum between the students and the faculty. And in that co-creation to really be deeply engaged with community and with the resources and the assets of that community.
Very good. And one more question, out of respect of your time, I'm going to hand it to Stacy Ziegler.
Thank you. Dr. Humphrey, fantastic presentation, very thoughtful, and I agree this is a wonderful way to kick off the conference. Mine is really simple, I think. I always try, this is it's a big thing, right? This culture change is huge. Yes, and I'm always looking for where are the quick wins, the bright spots, something that we can kind of instantly work with. The concept of the pass-fail, as far as inclusiveness and kind of leveling the playing field, if you will, fascinates me. Is that something that was always in place throughout your curricula, or was that something that you implemented, and how does that work? Is that a quick win, of a quick change?
Yeah, I would say that it is potentially a quick win for the students, but not necessarily for the faculty. There are a lot of faculty, in my experience, who really do not buy in or support the pass-fail assessment system. However, I personally had a great advantage. And the advantage I had is that system was set up at the University of Chicago in the 1960s. And so it has been in place for decades. It was in place when I was a medical student there. So I was much more a guardian of that assessment system than the person who had to put it in place in the beginning. But when it was put in place in the beginning, back in the 1960s, it was put in place for what I thought was a really interesting reason. And that is, in the case of the University of Chicago, the medical school started because a group of PhD students who were getting their PhDs in the biological sciences wanted the opportunity to apply that PhD work in a medical setting. And so they worked with university leaders to plant the idea and to plant the seeds for a medical school. Once the medical school was established, it did not take a very long period of time before there was a very disparate population, a population of people who just recently earned their PhD degree in one of the biological sciences, and then a group of students straight out of college who had an undergraduate major, perhaps in biology, or it could have even been in the humanities. And so bringing together students with such different educational backgrounds, the person who was the dean at that time said, we want to have a student body with this rich variety of backgrounds in science and in the humanities. And the only way to have a level playing field is to recognize that they are going to learn medicine at different rates based on their background and experiences. So it was started, I think, with a very well-intentioned effort. And while there are faculty who still don't necessarily support the effort, because when they went to medical school, they were ranked 1 through 150 and they finished #1 in their class. So, there are people who hold on to that view. But medicine is increasingly moving toward a competency-based framework where there are certain skills that we can, at the end of graduation, say to the public, this student can do the following things and is competent in the following elements and ready to enter a residency program.
Excellent. So I will cut off the questions there, Dr. Humphrey. You went over our agreed upon time, so I appreciate that very much. So thank you, and a virtual round of applause for Dr. Humphrey. Thank you very much for giving us your time and your insight. I've definitely learned a lot in the last hour. So
Well,
thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Greg, to you and your colleagues, and I wish you well over these next few days. And as I said at the outset, I was so inspired by your mission and your vision, and I'm eager to watch what you are all going to do. And thank you so much for this invitation.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.